Hello, welcome to the Official Spotlight on Procurement podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. Today, delighted to say that I'm joined by Emma-Jane Houghton. Emma-Jane is the FMC Commercial Director at the Atomic Weapons Establishment, or AWE as it's also known. AWE is an organisation at the forefront of nuclear technology and innovation in the UK. Prior to AWE, Emma-Jane has held senior industry roles in the Cabinet Office and at Heathrow Airport, and has worked also in senior roles in a number of consultancies. Emma-Jane, given your considerable experience, particularly in the field of infrastructure and construction projects, I think a lot of our conversation today will be focused in and around that, and particularly this idea that you've been talking about and developing in terms of the idea of a client of choice. Maybe as a bit of context, we should start. I'm sure lots of people listeners to this will be procurement people, but not necessarily people that work in the capital infrastructure side of procurement. So when we talk about client or clienting in that context, what do we actually mean?
It's an excellent question, and I think historically we've used client in the form of noun, and we're more readily these days talking about client in terms of a verb. To client, what does that mean? And for major infrastructure programs, it's describing the role and the activities around the role of being either the owner or being the buyer of a set of, in our case, policy outcomes. For AWE, for example, the client for FMC program is FMC as a client, and FMC client has a particular role that will then dovetail with that of other consultancies or other suppliers in the market. And that client role, its personality, the breadth of what it undertakes, the roles and responsibilities that sit within it, should differ between different programs depending on the activities, depending on the risk profile, and a whole heap of other things besides. So that is what we mean when we say to client, and that is what we mean when we talk about the client in a delivery model structure.
Has the industry been good at clienting historically?
I think there are some success stories. From my perspective, and this is reflected in some of the research that we've undertaken recently, I think my position is that clienting hasn't had sufficient scrutiny. I think it is well overdue a spotlight on the art and the practice of clienting, and indeed what do we mean by clienting itself. And I argue from a place of, for example, contracting, and I'm using the different words that you have for your supply chain, but so contracting, or to be a consultant, we have professional trade bodies, we have professional practice that sits in and around this, and a clear expectation of what good would look like in that space. And those consultants, those contractors, those architects, for example, they are subject to significant scrutiny in how they undertake that professional role. The same isn't true of clienting. We have a lot of talk about being an intelligent client. I also take issue with some of the wording around intelligent clients, and in some ways that has been quite helpful, and that has been in some ways progressive. But I think it doesn't sufficiently capture the complexity of what we need to think about when we think about clients, and doesn't go far enough in terms of professionalising what we should hope and we should aspire to in terms of these clients, which are, if it were private sector, they'd have a fiduciary duty to make sure that the monies that were being invested and being looked after were done so on behalf of the ultimate owner. And in the public sector example, in my view, there should be a similar test, a similar benchmark to make sure that the taxpayer monies are being guarded in a way that delivers the value for the end user, for that end taxpayer.
Yeah, presumably in saying that clienting done well is therefore, in your mind, a huge value opportunity for that organisation. There is a massive disconnect between good clienting and bad clienting in terms of the outcome. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And I think, what we've got to remember, especially in the construction industry, where many of the participants in that very fragmented supply chain or very fragmented supplier base, if it's flatter, they are operating on very thin margins. Often this is between 3 and 5%, and they are not in a position to be market makers. They are in a position to respond to a mandate that a client puts out there. So in these instances, for these public sector programs, for these big complex infrastructure projects, the client really is king or queen in terms of determining personality, attitudes, risk profile, how it's going to engage with stakeholders, timeframes, the whole temporary organisation and the whole personality of how that programme is going to be undertaken really is dictated by the client. So absolutely, for me, they are in an ultimate position of power in terms of making those decisions and setting the roadmap.
Yeah, in your observations, when you look at that clienting responsibility, where are the opportunities for improvements, broad terms?
Well, I think that it's just not been thought about in a holistic way. And as I said at the beginning, I think that there's an opportunity to professionalise not just the leadership, but how we conceive these temporary organisations and then design the programme setup. And we've had a go at determining that these clients should be intelligent.
Yeah.
And I mean, part of the research that we've undertaken shows that that is not clear to industry what that actually means, but it certainly leans towards an assumption that a client should have all the answers. It should have high IQ, it's focused on skill, it's focused on knowledge, and it's largely focused on having all the answers. And what the research is pointing to is that that actually presents a problem for these complex programs, because often they are one-off. Often we are dealing with many risks and unknowns, wicked type risks, where you cannot understand what the solution should be at the outset. And all of that landscape, particularly for public sector programmes where the macro political environment moves all the time, it points to an agile approach, and an agile approach where you have the right people around the table, the right capabilities, but where you are drawing on those capabilities to get to answers to complex problem statements rather than a client having all of the answers. So in some ways, expecting a client to be intelligent in that environment is actually setting yourself up for failure, because we already know that we're not going to have all the answers at the outset. So that sort of makes no sense.
Got you. And I think a couple of times you've used the term personality, which is really interesting, because that's it's almost like an EQ type quality. It suggests lots more than just data. Is that a deliberate thing? When you talk about personality, is that specific?
I think it is. And it's not something we really talk about. But when we set out the context to this challenge, when we thought about clienting earlier in the year, it's from the backdrop of IPA confidence at a real low at the moment. If we look at the stats from 2013, successful project delivery, 48% in 2013. It's 2019, the latest stat, but fallen to 17%. So we think something's not going quite right with the project setup. If you look at the snapshot from the IPA ratings, we've got, and this is at the end of March 23, the delivery confidence for green is only assigned to 25 projects, which is 10% of the GMPP portfolio. 23 projects assigned, red 9%, the remaining 183 amber in the middle, which is this 75%. So that tells you something about the delivery confidence and the mandate, really, or the impetus to do something differently in how we think about setting these programs up. And sorry, to come to your specific question on personality, I think the focus on skill and knowledge takes you to a place of IQ rather than EQ. But when you test, and we have tested this in our research through the surveys and through the one-to-one interviews that we've undertaken with the Major Projects Association, what it shows is that actually the things that are prized by project participants and the things which are more likely to lead to project turnaround where it is in distress are the qualities like humility, like collaboration, like relationship building. So all of the evidence that we've looked at so far points to qualities being more important in how you define a clienting organisation than the IQ, which is the skill and the knowledge. Now, that's not to say that we want ignorant clients, but it's definitely telling us something about the personality, the culture, certainly the leadership, and how it feels to interface, work in, or be a stakeholder that's connected to one of these client organisations is far more important than we have understood to date.
You referenced a couple of times the research you've been doing. It would be great if you could just give a bit more context with that. I believe it's with the University of Southampton, but it would be great to get your kind of perspective on specifically what that is.
Well, I started to look at client models as a part of my role with, as you said at the beginning, with Atomic Weapons Establishment. And AWE's been a huge sponsor of this piece of work, because, and AWE is a really good example, because it recognises as a company that it is undergoing a huge change and a huge transformation, because it's moving its business from essentially an ops type business to a major capex investment business. And that means it needs to think about how it clients its own capex portfolio. So happily have had a mandate to go and look at this as commercial director, because I've got to work out what the right client model is for our future materials campus programme. And that led me to undertake work with the Nuclear Commercial Directors Forum that has all of Defence Nuke and all of Civ Nuke sat within it. And then collectively we are saying, as commercial directors for government and for AOB, what is the right clienting model, given that we are going to market for similar capabilities and given that we've got similar challenges that we grapple with now. And so I wrote I gave a speech at an event with Red 10 alongside Chloe McCulloch from Building, who was reporting on the Commissioner's report, and with Hannah Vickers, who was reporting on the CLC productivity report. And between us, Chloe set out some of the problems that still existed in industry. Hannah set out the size of the prize in terms of productivity report, because we've still got all of these issues with productivity, which we know about. And then it was my job to say, well, what can we do about it? And how do we solve some of those barriers that still exist? And how do we go after that productivity prize? And for me, it was all about creating the right pull from a different deal with clienting organisations that could set the direction for change and then work collectively on that mandate. And so since then, I wrote a piece for Building. I've been working with the Major Projects Association, who've been brilliant in helping to sponsor a piece of work to survey their members. So we've undertaken a literature review I think we've looked at over 70 academic papers. With the MPA, we undertook a survey. More than 200 of their members responded to that. And then separately, we've undertaken 20 interviews with industry professionals across the full supply chain. And yes, I'm a visiting fellow with Southampton Business School, and we are working with Southampton to look at the data capture methodology to refine that and to produce a paper essentially on where we think clienting is up to, what we think the opportunities are, and what that data set is really telling us and where we could take this next.
Understood. And it touched on it earlier, you phrase you've used with me a lot, which resonated, this idea of a client of choice. Is that your shaping of what a client of choice is informed by all of this research and all of this experience? And
so the idea of the incomplete client, which is the research and the concept behind the whole thing, says that it's a waste of time to design one client model that thinks it's got all of the answers, because we can already see that this intelligent approach to knowing all of the answers in advance is not going to work and doesn't work, because that's what the statistics tell us. And that we are far better to focus on that and qualities, because it's qualities that are prized more highly, and it's qualities that give us a better result when a project is in complexity, it's in wicked risk, or it's in distress. And therefore, the better response is to focus on being a client of choice. Whatever that client of choice design might be, depending on your circumstances, in response to accepting this premise that you are incomplete. So there will be no one-stop shop answer for clienting. It's more around embracing that we need to professionalise this more, accept that it's more about orchestrating the right teams to get to the right answers than it is about being at the top of a hierarchy. That said, it has been my job as commercial director for FMC to design a client of choice model that works for us, and that is what I have been focused on. I think in the end, the ambition for this should be that we accept being an incomplete client is a great thing to be, and that as commercial directors and programme professionals, we solve for being a client of choice in a way that suits the market that you have, the complexity of stakeholder environment, the policy objectives, etc., etc. This is where we're up to in the research.
It's fascinating, and it's not an area I'm an expert in at all, but taking away from what you're saying, it sounds like there's a move, as you say, the incompleteness, a sense of collaboration, I guess almost a sense of trust of the partners that you're working with. One is that fair, and is that a difficult thing for the broader client base to accept? Are you pushing against an open door with this idea of changing the way that we client, or is there a degree of resistance from the way the market presently works?
There will be resistance, because this is not how it is typically done. So typically what we see, and there's a whole heap of reasons for this, but typically what we see is a focus on IQ, it's a focus on having all of the answers, a focus on hierarchy in particular, which leads to often forceful type A leaders who, exacerbates this problem of having all the answers, because that's the command and control type of leadership.
Yeah.
It also leans more towards having a plan and driving the plan, as opposed to perhaps having a more strategic, risk-based context and working in an agile way and bringing the right people in at the right time across different project phases. So there is resistance to the extent that is not what we do at the moment. And then there needs to be support and a different type of solution in order that we can come up with something different in a way that works for people. Yeah. I think there is less resistance around the acceptance that we need to do something differently. In particular, there is an open door, I would say, in many parts of the supply chain who are jumping up and down for a different deal or a different way to participate. It's not a difficult sell to suppliers to say, come and tell us and give us your ideas of how you can help us do this differently, because they would be really willing to do that.
Yeah. So, Jane, I'm assuming all this work has been an important part of your role to this point. It'd be fascinating to get your perspective of, we're recording this at the end of 2024. What does 2025 look like for you?
Great question. So I've been in this role for 2 years now on FMC, and I've been busy with my commercial team and wider program team, focusing on the setup of the program and all of the enabling commercial activities. So the new commercial strategy, working with our colleagues in D&O and indeed across Whitehall as a part of the broader business case, to work out basically how we move from a project-based approach to a programmatic one, and to design a commercial strategy which is programmatic and has those benefits at the centre of it. And we have been really successful in those 2 years. We are on track to move forward with the next stage of the business case in the new year. We have just put out our pin to the market to commence formal market engagement, building on some of the soft market engagement we did earlier in the year. And we have sign off of the FMC commercial strategy as a part of that. So these are great milestones, and kudos to the teams that have worked so hard on that over the past 18 months in particular. Yeah. As I move into the new year, I'm delighted to share that I have been promoted. I'm moving into the Estates and Liabilities team as Director for Estates Strategy and Planning.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And yes, that is a real career change for me, to move from commercial into a more delivery focused role.
Okay.
And big thanks to AWE for the sponsorship through the MPLA course, the Major Projects Leadership Academy course, which was a big part of understanding that is really what I want to do with my career next, and the development opportunity to develop the skills to do so. So lots achieved so far. Really loving my time at AWE, and big new role in the new year. I'm excited for that.
Fantastic. Yeah, sounds super exciting. And Emma-Jane, conscious of time, probably my last question. It's fascinating to hear all about these ideas, this thinking. Probably two questions. If people are listening to this and want to understand a bit more about some of that research and that work you're doing, where should they go? And then also, if people are listening to this and perhaps haven't got the background you've got in infrastructure capital, that part of procurement, I mean, is there a sales pitch you'd make? Is it an area people should be interested in getting involved in?
Absolutely, it's an area to get involved in. And I can make the plug for being a non-cognate, because this was always a big deal for me when I started working in construction industry at university, because I did a music degree. And they called you a non-cognate when you did your...
I've never heard that term.
I still don't really understand what that means. Anyway, I am one. I'm a non-cognate. But that doesn't matter. And you can move into commercial and do the learning as you go, do the qualifications. It's a fascinating sector. Yeah. It's a fascinating area of professional practice. I would advocate it strongly to anybody. And don't let them tell you need a degree in it, because you don't.
In terms of some of your thinking, the work you've been doing on client of choice, anywhere people should go to get, if they want to be involved, right?
Yes, and please do, because we're still in the phase of gathering people's inputs and critique on various aspects of it. We have the survey that is still live, and there's a QR code that I can share. I really would welcome people's thoughts on the campaign as we progress it through into the Q1 of next year. Yes, please.
Brilliant. LinkedIn is a good way to contact you, Emma-Jane, if people want to get in touch.
Yeah, LinkedIn's absolutely perfect. Drop me a note on there.
Emma-Jane, thank you so much for talking to me today. That's super interesting.
Thank you for having me.
I've learned a new phrase. What was it? Non-cognate?
Non-cognate.
Yeah, I'll take that away. But no, thank you so much. Congratulations on the new role. Best of luck with everything. And yeah, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks, Simon. Good to see you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.